Welcome to MetroSTL. I'm your host, Antonio French. We start today with part 2 of our 4-part series, Benign Neglect, looking at the history of North St. Louis. In part 1, we looked at the so-called Team 4 plan, which called for essentially withholding resources from poor, predominantly African-American areas of North St. Louis. In part 2, we find that much of the scene had been set before Team 4 was ever even thought of.
So if this decay and decline on the north side of St. Louis was not essentially legislated by the city, how did it happen? After all, much of today's North St. Louis looks like the result of the benign neglect the Team 4 plan is accused of promoting. Well, as it turns out, mandates were not needed to essentially follow the plan, which called on the cash-strapped city to take resources out of poor, predominantly African-American neighborhoods and focus them elsewhere.
Was it implemented?
I would say yes.
Bob Lewis, current SLU professor and former Team 4 consultant, says this all happened largely because of math. Even without legislation, city policy and private development were going to gravitate naturally toward areas that provided the most potential bang for the buck. Very few of those financially promising areas were in African-American neighborhoods.
So I can understand the emotions that came out of reading the policies recommended in that 74 plan, and can understand even to this day why they're still hanging around, partly because it's still general policy anyway, whether anybody is acknowledging it or not.
And Team 4 is typical of what a lot of cities did at the time. It's like, well, we don't have money to buy up the blighted land. We don't have money to put anything in its place. What can we do?
Here's the question.
Colin Gordon is a researcher. He wrote the book Mapping Decline, which documents the erosion of North St. Louis, among other places, over the last 5 decades. He had a team in town researching another book recently. He says as the years went on in the 1970s and beyond, St. Louis's problems were not changing, and much of what Team 4 had proposed, those depletion areas the plan had discussed, still were viewed as lacking in a financial future, not so much because they were black, but because they were poor.
No one really wants to accommodate the poor. They just want a better use of the land that the poor is occupying. They want higher tax revenues out of it and higher use. So you're really talking about the distribution of resources within a metropolitan area. And that, I think, makes the idea of planning for decline on that sort of local basis a little more obnoxious and sort of racially tinged. The idea that you're going to allow some neighborhoods to die and even withdraw services.
It's been called by many a racist undertaking. Was it that in your eyes?
I don't think that it was racially motivated, but I think it reflected a deeply racist pattern of public and private policy that had created the problem in the first place.
In other words, these areas became poor to begin with due to the policies of racism that date back not years, but centuries.
Oh, they've tried to kill that North St. Louis a long time ago.
Freeman Bosley Sr., now well into his 80s, can recall those days long before Team 4 had even been thought of.
Certain areas of the city, particularly those south of Delmar, the building inspectors would go in and check those buildings out. But between Delmar up to St. Louis Avenue, they just let that go to hell in a handbasket, because they knew at one time or another that would run down to the point where they could come in there and not necessarily through eminent domain, but just the properties would get so bad that the city could just take them over. People that had money that were up in this area between Delmar, Dr. Martin Luther King, King's Highway, those people moved out.
So by the time those board bills and then the Team 4 plan itself came and went, poor neighborhoods in St. Louis, particularly on the north side, were mostly African American and had been for years. And while those folks were able to mobilize politically to stop the Board of Aldermen from implementing the Team 4 plan as law, they could only guard against its concepts for so long.
People go on with their daily life. They can't afford to just sit there and just constantly watch what the city is doing 24/7.
And as the 70s turned into the 80s and 90s, city leaders, a little bit at a time, possibly without even realizing it, were doing exactly what the Team 4 plan had proposed, taking resources away from areas already in the worst shape. Some call it urban triage, others benign neglect.
It seems very much like what was being discussed and talked about during that particular time. Remove the services. You didn't have as much garbage pickup. You wouldn't have as much any of the other city services, pavement of streets and things of that nature. And then eventually folks will become so disgusted where they will move on their own.
It certainly wasn't intended to deprive them of fundamental city services, police protection, garbage collection, fire protection, building enforcement, code enforcement, and so forth. It's more the reinvestment side of things. Taking community development kinds of monies, for example, and saying this is where we're actually going to support development because we can leverage on strengths that are nearby.
One of the ironies of the Team 4 is much of what they argued became very popular a generation later, when smaller industrial cities like Youngstown and Dayton started adopting what they called sort of smart decline strategies. Where they said, well, look, we're not going to get any more population. And so we have this blighted, largely abandoned part of the city. Let's turn it into a park.
We can take better care of our neighborhoods.
But there are plenty who believe the racial element of this was not an accident or an oversight.
They must have also realized that blacks were enormously discriminated against in terms of employment and jobs and bank loans and things of that nature that would allow for any group of people to be able to maintain or to keep things up.
And so, like a sort of death by 1,000 cuts, the downward slide of these neighborhoods continued with little apparent hope for change. That's until the early 21st century arrived and a new name arrived with it, Paul McKee. But would he be a savior or a slumlord? We'll look into that in our next report. George Sells, MetroSTL.com.
Joining me now is George Sells. George, thank you for being here, and part two is just as informative as part one. What did you find as far as how this became law de facto without even actually becoming official policy?
Well, it depends on who you ask as to why it went this way. It was really kind of an evolution. Even without it being an official policy, there was still a numbers game here. Because the realities that did not change were the fact that the city did not have much money. The city had areas, neighborhoods that were in really bad shape, and the city was having to kind of exercise that urban triage that's been discussed as far as deciding where to put their money. And at the end of the day, the choices that were made, probably in some cases without even looking at the Team 4 plan, were based on deciding this is an area that we can help grow, and this is an area that probably won't grow. I think it was looked at in many cases as not putting good money after bad, but they were looking at it very much on a financial level. I think what was interesting was that we talked to some folks who basically pointed to the fact that the scene for this was set way before Team 4. The institutional racism going back to the 1800s in this city is what led to those neighborhoods that were so poor almost exclusively being black neighborhoods, almost exclusively being on the north side. Mm-hmm. And some even argued that by the time it got to Team 4, really the die was already cast. And that this was much more about economics and poor people than it was about race. But no one disagrees that race is the ultimate component that led to all this.
It was interesting in your report that several of the experts you talked to were a little timid about saying that racism was involved in this. Even though this was not long after restrictive covenants had just gotten struck down, which explicitly forbid African Americans from being able to buy property in certain areas. So is that just a coincidence, or do they think that this was not directly related to race? It was interesting.
It depended on who you
Of course, Percy
asked.
Green, he did not shy away from that at all when you talked to him.
And to be really frank about it, and it was interesting because everybody that we spoke to agrees that somewhere on the timeline, race is your factor, whether it's earlier, whether it's later. But there was some disagreement as to whether there was malice in the Team 4 plan specifically, and those answers were kind of still divided along racial lines. Like you said, Percy Green saw Team 4 as a flat-out racist undertaking. Freeman Bosley Sr., I think, saw it much the same way, and he was around during those times. The white respondents, who were also academics and have studied it pretty deeply, kind of took the longer view on it. I don't know that they were so much calling it a coincidence, but I think, again, they were looking at this as if you took race out of it and just looked at numbers, at financials. You've got this much to spend, and you've got this many places that you need to spend it, and you can't put it everywhere. Where do you put it? And I think the argument that they were making is that the poorest areas were always going to be the areas that were going to be neglected, whether those were poor white folks, poor Hispanic folks, poor Korean folks. It happens in the demographics of St. Louis. They happen to be poor African American folks. And again, that goes back to another 100 years of setting the groundwork for
Long
that.
history here in St. Louis. Team 4, the firm which prepared that initial report, is still around. Do they still have to deal with this every now and then, this backlash from something that the company did 40 years ago?
There are parts of it that are around. The way it was explained to me is that it was a group of consultants. They split late 70s, early 80s, or I guess it was early 80s. Bob Lewis, one of the people we spoke to, had been a part of Team 4. He left, formed his own company. So there were others that remained using the name Team 4. And Team 4 eventually was bought by another company. So they're sort of still around, sort of not. I did get to have a phone conversation with one of the original Team 4 consultants that was involved in this, and he wasn't interested in being a part of the story. He referred me to an editorial he wrote for another paper here in town a few years ago. I believe it was back in 2008, and kind of says what was conveyed in the first two parts, particularly by Bob Lewis, that the intention here was to attack a financial problem, and that looking at it in hindsight now, obviously the look isn't great, but there was never an intention of in some way attacking or harming the African American community. It was just a matter of what do you do when you have too much in need of help and not enough money.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We are looking forward to seeing part 3 of your report, and of course the written forms can be read in the Northsider and Southsider newspapers. Thank you. And now we turn to what many feel is a big win for the city this week. Major League Soccer is expanding to St. Louis, and proponents of the new team and its new stadium say this is about much more than sports.
It is with great honor and an incredible pleasure for me to announce that St. Louis will be the 28th team in Major League Soccer. Congratulations. Well done.
We want to turn downtown West into another great destination.
This city is on the verge of something huge.
It's a vision of a better downtown St. Louis.
There's still a lot of work to be done, but we're all rolling up our sleeves and we're getting it done.
And today, the opportunity to bring Major League Soccer to the Major League Soccer City becomes a reality.
You've talked a lot about making St. Louis a better place. making downtown a better place, being a citizen of downtown. Can you talk about the importance of that in the big picture and the scope of this?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things is that our goal was to have a great team both on the field and off the field. My family and the Kavanaugh family are very dedicated to having a great community, and part of that comes with being part of the community. So we think that, you know, having great institutions, you know, amazing school systems, great sports teams, continue this redevelopment of downtown and the revitalization of the region is exactly what we need. Because what I was saying was, and I believe this, St. Louis is an international city. And we're now on the international map, which is exactly where we need to be.
You've heard sports teams do not do anything to help the local economies in cities where they're at. I'd like you to take, for the people that say that, take a look at what the Stanley Cup run did for the city of St. Louis. Millions of dollars of new revenue in our city. But the other thing that it does is it brings people together, right? And it has people feel more of a sense of community. What that translates into is people doing, you know, more things within their community.
We had a failed public vote here, you know, less than 2 years ago, and I've always believed, you know, soccer is an emerging sport in America, and it's not been an easy task. We've gone through our trials and tribulations over the last 25 years, and my approach has always been that failure isn't fatal. I mean, I believe in that in life. If you're an athlete, you must believe in that. You can't win every day. And when we lost the vote, we kind of looked at that and said that doesn't mean St. Louis isn't right. It means we went about it the wrong way.
We have the stadium plan, we have the ownership group, and more importantly, we have the fan support. This city demonstrated the support and spirit that makes St. Louis unique.
What's the next step to getting this done? Because I know there's still a couple of things the Board of Aldermen you've got to get through. Is there going to be any hiccup in this, or do you feel pretty good that this is going to go through smoothly?
We're going to get this done.
Simple as that.
We're going to get this done.
It's starting to feel real. It's still a long ways off. A lot of work to be done, but it's kind of hard to believe that you know, a lot of work has gone in today. A lot of people have worked a lot for a long time.
I think today is a special day, and make no mistake about it, today we celebrate Major League Soccer coming to St. Louis, but more importantly, we celebrate this great city of St. Louis. But I remind you, it's only the beginning.
We wanted MLS for the Lou. And we got it.
Great. George, you did that story too.
Yep.
So big win for the city. A lot of people seem very excited in that report.
There are a lot of excited people, and I think that this is a morale booster. You know, sports fans, and I think the city in general, after the whole thing with the Rams and Stan Kroenke and the way that went down, it was kind of a slap across the face to the ego of St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's kind of that somebody likes us, you know, and I think that that's important for the psyche. Then you get down to some brass tacks things about numbers and about economic development and that sort of thing. And the belief of the Taylor family, of Jim Kavanaugh and others involved in this process is that this new stadium being built will create short-term jobs for the construction. It will create long-term jobs within the team. It will add activity to another area. It's another boost to the Central Corridor. And these are all things that these folks see as a positive for the city. Now, there are people out there, I've seen stuff on Twitter, I think I saw something from you on Twitter, asking the question about, you know, what does this do for the greater good for the folks that aren't soccer fans and don't necessarily work or do anything in the Central Corridor, the folks in North St. Louis, lower income folks in the southern part of the city. And their answer would be that it creates an economic engine that helps everybody, that helps the entire area, and that there will be benefit to go around. Also, they plan to use the stadium for other events, so it will not just be about soccer. They'll be using it for other civic events and things like that. And the argument is that if it's a good thing for the downtown area, it's a good thing for the city as a whole
and the region.
And if I can bring up one other thing, it's always interesting when you have this stadium conversation. I did a story years ago in Nashville with Phil Bredesen, who ended up being the governor of Tennessee, and was talking to him about when they built an arena in Nashville and a football stadium for teams that were not even committed to being there yet. And pointed out the fact that a lot of people say these stadiums do not oftentimes turn the profit or the economic impact that people feel they should to make that kind of investment. And his point always stuck with me. He said, what's the economic impact of a library or the economic impact of a park? And his point was sometimes things just make your city a better place, and that helps everyone involved.
Interesting. The ownership group are some of the wealthiest people in the state, and so there will be some ask at some point for some public contribution to this new stadium. Are they expecting a bit of a political fight when that comes?
They're not at all. Well, for starters, they're not asking for much. I think they're asking for some tax breaks on tickets and things like that, sales within the stadium, but they're basically footing the bill as far as building this thing. And Mayor Cruson was very interesting to talk to about this. There are a few things they're going to have to get through the Board of Aldermen still, some of the housekeeping with the finances, and this goes with so far into the details, I won't get into it all. But I asked Mayor Cruson, is this something, are we going to have a fight? Is this going to be anything difficult? And she looked at me and said, we're going to get this done. All she said, you see it in the piece,
Yeah,
we're going to get this done. And that's all, no elaboration, no nothing. So she is eminently confident. There's no reason she shouldn't be. I believe the vote was 26-2 on the resolution, basically endorsing this whole thing. I mean, good luck getting the Board of Aldermen to agree 26-2 on the sky being blue. So
Right.
I think they're in pretty good shape as far as that goes. And again, it's largely because the Taylor family and Jim Kavanaugh, basically, they're building this out of their pocket, and they feel like this is probably the way to go as far as just going with a straight private enterprise here.
Well, that's great. I mean, after the Rams situation, the city is not looking forward to being held hostage by any sports teams anymore.
And it was so frustrating with that because not only did they leave, but if you read their relocation application to the league, they basically torched St. Louis on the way out. It's like, it's bad enough that you leave, but you have to, go to the bathroom in the yard as you head for the car.
Right. It's great that some local folks are heading this organization this time
And
around.
they definitely are all about St. Louis when you talk to them about that.
Great. Thanks, George. Now we take a look at crime in the city. After several high-profile killings of children, there is a large amount of public pressure mounting on city officials to do something about the violence. The Southsiders' Jim Merkel sat down with one of St. Louis's top officials, Board of Aldermen President Louis Reed, for a very personal conversation about violence and what can be done.
I'm absolutely unhappy about the length of time that it's taken to get these body cameras in place. You figure over 600 days ago, right, nearly 2 years ago, we voted on the Board of E&A, and we voted to authorize the deployment of the free program that we put in place, that I put in place and negotiated on behalf of, for the city to get it done. After it was voted on at the Board of E&A to move forward with it, it never moved. We are sitting here right now today with a 7-year-old kid that has been murdered, and their parents are planning a funeral. What you hear coming from law enforcement, the courts, and everybody else around it, they're saying, hey, the community won't come forward and give us the information. Right? When we look at some of the things that body cameras do, one of the things that body cameras do, they help to create a better environment between law enforcement, the city, and the community, because the interactions between law enforcement and the community become better. Right, there are more positive interactions that happen. Right, it begins to allow that healing process to happen. Especially now, given the fact that we have a $20+ million budget surplus, and everybody says it's about funding. Well, then now we just given the money that we have available, we should be able to address the issues of body cameras and take that off the table and move forward. The other thing is Operation Ceasefire. what the data shows us is that these old models that we are deploying, they don't work, right? The data shows us that in an urban setting, we're going to have to do something different, right? You have to have a public, what the new models show us is that a public health approach to addressing the issues of gun violence in the urban setting is the way to do it, and do it in a real manner and a sustainable manner. How much more data is it going to take to show that hotspot policing is not what needs to happen to address this issue in our city, right? It takes a much different approach than that. I have cousins that have had, their kids shot and killed, right? My brother that was right above me, when, he was shot and killed, not in the city of St. Louis, but he was shot and killed. He was my best friend, right? So I know that hurt and that pain. Just weeks ago, friends of ours that have, volunteered and helped, my office and other people, out for years, some of their kids got, end up getting shot, right? This stuff is real and it's happening on a daily, it's happening all too often in our city. People need to remember that these folks, they're not just numbers, right? It's not just, number 1, number 2, number 131, number 252, or whatever it is, right? No, it was somebody's son, somebody's daughter, somebody's mother, father. Somebody loved these people that are being taken away. If we have solutions out there that could begin to help address these things that other cities are deploying today and driving their murder rate down, then why in the heck aren't we doing it?
Joining me now is the Southsiders, Jim Merkel. Hey, Jim, welcome. Welcome to the show.
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. So you had a very personal conversation here with President Reed. Why did this touch him so deeply?
Well, just last winter, his nephew was murdered and burned in a dumpster. Oh, wow. His son, just a few weeks ago, was held up at gunpoint outside his house, and his brother was murdered. I don't know if I could stand it all. He's such a happy person, but he was so serious and so, on top of this, we have all these kids getting killed, and after about 40 minutes, he had to cut it off. We had everything we needed, because he just couldn't go on. So this isn't just politics. Yeah. It is politics, I'm sure, but it isn't just politics.
Yeah, it's personal for him. As a city resident, it touches all of us. He has been pushing for this ceasefire program for a long time.
Okay.
What is he saying has held it up, and were there recent developments this week in the Board of E&A? I understand that the mayor has now joined to support his idea?
It's actually a cure of violence, which is a way just to go into neighborhoods and really go down, treat it like an illness, and just where there's a certain person or an issue of possible conflict, you deal with that conflict before it develops into violence. And it seems to me like a good way to go. And so the mayor has been, with the budget this past year, the one that was just ended, they said, well, we'll say some kind of alternative program. And now she's on the board for this specific program, which had...
But how much was he asking for it? Is this a few $100,000 or $1 million?
Well, I mean, it's in the budget for $500,000, but he was talking about for for one center location, 2 on. outside, about $1 million a year or whatever. And so now at this point, there has to be special emergency legislation. I was told by the comptroller's spokesperson yesterday that the comptroller, Darlene Green, is looking at it, and she wants to see some actual contracts before she would push,
give her support to it.
Sure.
And now this would be in addition to the $400 million we already spend every year on public safety. So it's just a drop in the bucket. Well, thank you, Jim, and people can read your report in the this week's Southsider.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Well, that's our show for today. Please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like and share our videos on Facebook. And check MetroSTL.com every day for new stories and videos. Until next time, I'm Antonio French. Thanks for watching.